Okay, good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Sticky Notes Chat with me, Chris Nada, and also Amanda Stockwell and Cory Lebson. So this week, apparently, I have some technical issues which is stopping me from having a very good audio quality and video quality. So you're going to get the privilege of listening to me without watching me for most of this. But for the beginning of it, I thought I'd better at least have something that showed who I was and what we were doing. So this is what you get for now, and then you're going to hear a
Mhm.
disembodied voice from now on. But before we disembody my voice, let me just say what we're going to be talking about this week. So this week is all about stories, and by that, what we mean is user experience people have a lot of data to get across and a lot of information about the users that we're building stuff for to tell to the rest of the team. And sometimes the team aren't always that receptive to that kind of information. So, what can we do to help them? And one of the ways that really helps is turning everything that we've got into a story. And I'm not talking about little fairy tales. I'm talking about something that really brings those people to life so that the people on the team can understand that, oh, these are different people to me, and yes, they have different needs than I do, and perhaps then become more aware of who these people are and what their needs are. So that's what this week is about. I'm glad that you're here watching. If you don't know where we have all this kind of information about when you can see us and where, then check out our website at stickynotes.chat. That has details of all the upcoming sessions. And you can always get in touch with us at our email, which is chat@stickynotes.chat, or on LinkedIn. You can just follow our hashtag Sticky Notes Chat, and you'll get information about everything we do. And if you follow the three of us, you get notification when we go live every week. So anyway, back to the story. And I'm going to turn off my video so that these two can have more bandwidth to themselves. So here we go. Boink. Oh, look,
Aw.
I'm a little white blob. So Amanda, after doing
Yes,
that intro, have you had time to we were trying to troubleshoot before this session, so we didn't even talk about what we were going to talk about.
we did not.
Amanda, stories. Do you have a story about
Oh,
stories?
I have so many stories about stories, but the first thing I want to kind of like put in people's brain and as just a reminder, because I feel like, at least for a moment there, stories and UX became one of those buzzwords that everybody's kind of throwing into everything. And there's storyboards, and there's if you work in agile, there's user stories and story points and all kinds of stuff. So let me just first be perfectly clear, there's lots of different types of things, but a story, when we're in this context, is some sort of narrative arc that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so I like to remind people that stories aren't special to UX. UX did not invent stories. Narrative arc has existed for a very long time. And it's just a tool that you can use when you are talking about research you gathered or data that you've gathered to help set context and help people connect to what you've gathered. Because there's all kinds of research about how deeply rooted storytelling and story listening is to humans. So, and I should have in the few minutes before we were doing this, I should have looked it up so I would remember exactly what the percentages were. But there's all kinds of research about, like, if you just give people data points, they'll remember like a 16% of the information you give them or something. But if you can tell people something in a story and give it context so they can connect to it, they'll remember like 60% or something like that. I'll look it up later. I'll post the like Stanford study that it came from. But so with that said, I have lots of stories about using stories. And one of the things that I particularly like to use stories for is to point out that if any part of a story arc is missing, that's an opportunity for the team. So it's super simple, and I will totally big credit to Donna LaCaw. If you've not read her book, which I don't remember exactly the title of, it is the you. Hold on, I should have done all kinds of looking up apparently today. It's the user's journey story mapping products that people love is the name of the book. She goes into much greater detail than I do, but one of the things she talks about is using story arc to point out when there's something missing about a story. And so one of the ways, my favorite ways to use storytelling in UX is to point out when something is broken, and to point out that it's part of the narrative arc that's broken, because it's 3 steps, it's 3 pieces, it's simple for people to wrap their brain around, and it's something that everybody kind of intrinsically understands. So the circle back to the story about a story. The story that I have is that I was a couple of years ago working on an application that, how to phrase this, people who worked at a specific company had to use in order to get paid. It was mandatory for them to get their money through this application. So they needed to have access to it, which meant that they needed to sign up and they needed to have their specific client ID and all this stuff. But the onboarding process when I started the project took people typically 20 to 30 minutes in a context where they didn't typically have very stable internet for very long. Chris, I think you might be able to empathize, but not very stable internet at the moment.
Just a little.
Just a little. But so these were people who worked really, really, really long hours, had very limited time off, and in their time off had to, in order to get paid, had to get set up with this system. And it took them most of their breaks. It didn't always work because things would time out before they completed. And then they just couldn't get paid and they had to wait until the next cycle through that they could onboard in order to get access. I mean, the money still went to their account, but they couldn't have any access to it unless they signed up for this thing. So
that sounds ridiculous. That sounds, I mean,
it was
already telling me that story. I can tell that the hero can't complete the hero's journey because the hero is being stopped by monsters along the way. I mean, this is pretty terrible.
Right. So the way that yes, it was horrible, and at least everybody agreed that it was horrible. The part that was a little bit less clear was what to do about it. So what I did, me and a colleague did, is we printed out screenshots of each of the steps of the onboarding process and went into a conference room and made a literal physical arc of like all of the steps that it took to get to the even just sign up process, and showed that what should have been, a nice little, like a little bit of build, okay, a nice peak, and then great, you've signed up, you can have your money now, looked like this, and then they maybe never even got to it. So that was the most visceral kind of like tangible storyline that I was able to show. And we literally, it was a bunch of engineers and product people and some designers in a room. But basically we literally started like cutting out pieces of paper where we're like, this is the only thing on this 3 screens that they actually need. Cool, let's cut that out. We'll use that. And so in the kind of course of the exercise, we went from this multiple screen mess to we cut out the individual pieces that we actually needed and they actually needed, and then made our own pretty little storyline of, hey, here's what the flow of this should actually look like. Not in terms of like the actual UI looked like, but like, here's the information we actually need to gather and when and how. And we built kind of a new storyline. And I will say that even without any other improvements, funneling down that experience made the users of this particular system much, much, much happier.
Well, so I'm actually, so backing up a little bit, I think I want to kind of also, as we talk about storytelling in UX, in the practice of the, I guess the practice of doing the UX and creating the narrative, but also the storytelling. Let's also make sure to make a note to talk about storytelling in UX careers. I think there's a lot to be said for that. something that I'm particularly interested in as well. But to the original question, Chris, about storytelling, my favorite way to do storytelling, and I will say it's a little bit labor intensive as a researcher, is to do storytelling through videos. Often when I'm doing research, and there's more of kind of a meta story of stories, but when I'm doing research, I'm always doing like running the video, the whole time, recording everything. But a fair number of my projects, maybe 60% of my projects, I'm actually producing a series of video clips to tell the story. So there might be a PowerPoint saying, this is what happened, this is the issue, here's some recommendations, but let's hear it in the user's own words. So the story kind of jumps into that arc of, the video rather jumps into the arc of the storytelling and tells the story. I find for me as a researcher, when they're like, oh my God, really? That really happened? They really said that? I didn't believe it when I read it, but now I hear it. And I think that's the number one way that I find that I leverage storytelling in my research itself, as well as like a standard set of deliverables from journey maps, to various to personas, telling stories of individual users, journey maps telling the path that users take. I think similar to kind of your arc, Amanda. And certainly there's a variety of storytelling deliverables I find that I use kind of on a regular basis, but none that I find as valuable as those labor-intensive video clips.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I know that I have heard rumblings of people saying, well, like, it takes so much time. Do we really need to do that? Is it really that different? But in a way different context of a story. So one of the other really important kind of elements about telling stories is that there can be a better like emotional connection when you can understand the context of a person and kind of understand the story about them. And so even if you don't do the full video clip, even if you just have like an image or something, like I have frequently told this story that I kind of joke about, like the tier that changed 1,000 launches, where in a usability test ages ago, we caught a very, very, very frustrated woman on camera with a smidgen of a tear starting to come down her eye because without telling that whole story, basically, she was working on a project that we were working on that had an editor. She got interrupted and it did not autosave, and so she lost like an hour of work. And it was in context of her real business, so it was actual work that she lost, not just usability test work. And she was extremely frustrated. And autosave wasn't like a sexy new feature or really even something we were thinking about or considering, but it was really important to our users, and it was something we hadn't even known that we should be looking for or thinking about. But capturing that teeny itty bitty tear in a picture allowed us some leverage to kind of go and make the case that like we really need to pause and pay attention to this, and it's really important to our users. And if they don't have it, we're going to have more crying Karens or whatever, like we're going to have more really frustrated people. So another important thing with that, and I think this is true whether you're talking about personas or journeys or telling, to Cory, your point, like telling the story about yourself, one of the reasons that stories are so powerful is because you can tap into emotion, and you can tap into really kind of helping people see the full picture and the broader context and the true impact, rather than just 3 out of 5 users could not find X thing. It allows you to layer on some more context and make it really help people identify with what you're actually trying to tell them.
Yes, well, I think that's a good promo. If someone's interested in that, there's this empathy and UX course out there which has a section about storytelling and emotion. And actually, but to your point, that I did, by the way, I should probably say that. But anyway, but to the point of peers, yeah, when I was doing a lot of work on disasters, I remember, there were participants would recount their natural disaster experiences, and they'd be crying on camera or emotively, like, kind of just expressing a lot of emotions about the experience. One, it was, I think it was probably the hardest one for me as a moderator, like not to be in tears myself listening to them. But also, when I got that on camera and I could show it to the stakeholders and say, look, this is what people are going through. You've got to improve that experience. Again, I think I definitely had those kind of the tears. The tears helped the narrative to improve the product, to help future disaster survivors. So, yeah, no, I totally hear you there.
You don't have to catch people crying. It could be that you catch people who have a really strong positive emotion too. So I always also like to kind of frame that story with context, which is that we certainly weren't expecting anyone to cry in that usability test. It was I guess, fairly dry business context within which we were testing. So sometimes when I tell people about that and I encourage them to use storytelling and emotion in their own work, they're like, yeah, but I work on B2B accounting software or something. And I'm like, well, that's okay. There's still people who are using that software. Those people still get frustrated or annoyed or pleasantly surprised by things. You don't always have to capture somebody crying. It doesn't always have to be like this big, gigantic deal.
We're not trying to make people cry when we
No.
when we do our user research. I mean, if they
Certainly
do,
not.
it is a very powerful storytelling mechanism, but it's not something we're trying to make them do. Yeah, I mean that definitely this idea of using emotion as something that helps you get your story across. Um, so Amanda, when you put the stuff up on the wall and you had the journey arc, the story arc, were you putting people's emotions on at various points in time as well? Because that's a typical story mapping technique, is that you show smiley faces and frowny faces along the story.
Yeah, so at that point, no, because it was pretty much understood that every step of the way was a frowny face. We didn't really need to focus on figuring out what the emotion was.
Yeah.
We pretty much knew that the whole thing was frustrating. And in that particular instance, so here's kind of a nuance for people to think about. It wasn't just a matter of saying, here's what the arc is and look how long it is. There was some internal debate about what things we really could cut out and whether things were really necessary. And I had a hypothesis that people didn't really understand how long the process was and didn't really understand how many times we were asking some of the same information multiple ways. And so I used the sort of story exercise to show, look, we have this piece of information here, we have this piece of information here, we have this piece of information. It has to go in this order, and because we had to basically verify their identities before we start giving them money, naturally. It had to go in a particular order, but we didn't always need to go off on this other tangent, and we didn't always need to ask them this other list of things again. So in that particular instance, the story arc for me was more about the steps, the journey. You're right, though. It is usually it is pretty common to do, a customer journey map or user story map, and kind of map out the steps and the associated emotion. But in this case, we kind of knew the emotion was the same the whole time. It just went from bad to worse. So we didn't so much focus on that, but I definitely have used that, particularly in the context of when I'm trying to help people understand where there might be opportunities to improve. So among that kind of classic story arc of there's some sort of incident, there's some building of action, there's some kind of peak, and then there's a kind of come down period. In that traditional peak, there's sort of reasonable emotions that are associated usually with a successful looking story. And so one of the things also that I've been able to use that kind of emotional mapping to stories for is when you want someone to be the most interested or excited, if they are actually the most frustrated or the most distracted or whatever. Then, by the way, it doesn't always mean it's a problem with your product. It could be that you're presenting it to them at the wrong time or trying to get them to focus on something that isn't relevant at the time or anything. But to kind of show a mismatch between what is actually happening and what would be maybe I guess ideal is a fuzzy word, but what would be better? What would be ideal from the business perspective? I use that a lot, that as a tool to kind of help people see where there's mismatches between what is and what could be.
And sometimes that mismatch is actually caused by something outside the software's control because, like you say, it could be that something's being presented at the wrong time. It could be that there's
Mm-hmm.
other paperwork they have to do. It could be there's another business process which is just a full hard stop. You can't get past this until you can't carry on with the software until you've done this other thing. There's lots of it, but even highlighting those things can help the company understand there's more to this than just this piece of software. There's other stuff we have to fix before we can actually make this experience, this customer journey, make any sense to people.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes you can't change some stuff,
So,
right? Like,
so Cory, you were talking about making people cry. Well, not making people cry, but having.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Amanda. Sorry.
oh no, you're good. I think
I,
Chris's technical difficulties continue. Cory, can you hear him okay?
Chris, are you there? Uh,
I'm still. I'm
you're still.
having my technical issues are really frustrating me today.
Oh, yeah.
You guys should carry on without me. You're doing fine without
Oh,
me. So,
sorry,
So,
Chris.
the
Chris,
question I was gonna,
yeah.
the question, the question I was, the question I was gonna ask was, what other techniques have you used for telling stories? Because I'm thinking there's things like personas is a way of telling a story about who your users are, not necessarily their journey, but who they are. Are there any other kinds of stories that you tell as well?
Well, yeah, and I think first of all, with personas, I've seen companies come and say, we do our personas. How do we do it? Well, we're going to do a survey of our users, and we say, like, what percentage of you are using this browser, what percentage that browser, and then we present these grids to you of data on our users, of their browser type and maybe their age and maybe their some demographics on their technology understanding, whatever. And so first of all, I want to say, that some of these storytelling techniques aren't often used for storytelling, and then they're not effective. Um, and simultaneously, I've seen kind of these proto personas created where it's a story, and you're like, well, what's backing it up? And they're like, well, we just know. So the sweet spot of kind of using, let's say, a persona would be you gather the data, you gather the analytics, whatever you need to know, and then the UXer create the story, create the narrative based on the data that you have. So with respect to personas, and also true with a customer journey map, for example, where you're not saying, well, yeah, we know from a couple of support calls that kind of goes like this, whatever, but really kind of gathering that data, being in support of research certainly is the story, as well as kind of the ad hoc methods and like the text narrative. I mentioned the video clips, and perhaps you have kind of a bullet. These were the issues users have, but sometimes to have like actually a text narrative that you can recite in a meeting, not reading it, but reciting it. Is you've got this, potentially it's not really a formal technique. I tell a story. It's it's story time. Line up, everybody, sit down. Get your milk and cookies. No, it's actually really kind of just, okay, I'm going to present to you information in this way. I'm going to be able to call on it when I'm in a meeting, and I have that knowledge, I have the data, and then someone says, no, we're going to do this. And you say, well, based on the data we have, this is a story. So I find a lot of my storytelling that I do is very ad hoc, not in the form of a deliverable, happening in a meeting, happening on a in a quick conversation or a quick text chat or whatever. Don't forget about sometimes there's no name associated with it. There's no bio, no fake aggregated bio of a persona. It's just a discussion. And I think really it's weaving storytelling into everything that we do as UXers. even if it doesn't have a name, besides, you don't even say I'm telling you a story now. It's just, like you weave it. It lives in the fabric of everything you talk about, of you create. You think in stories. You don't think in the data per se. I mean, you keep knowledge of the data. You keep knowledge of what really happened. You keep knowledge of the stakeholder constraints, and then you output. In your head, you turn that into a story wherever you go.
Well, and I think to that point, one of the reasons that stories can be so effective, and one of the ways that I've used them is depending on the context of the work, especially if you're doing like evaluation work, you might fairly often be in a context where you're telling people that something they've built isn't doing so hot, or they need to take a pivot, or you might be kind of in the seat of sort of offering some advice that is potentially a little bit might make people feel a little bit prickly. It might make people feel a little bit defensive of their work. And so one of the other things that I do is, even if I'm not telling an official story, I can give advice and recommendations in the context of not, this is me telling you that what you did was wrong, or that you need to change your mind, or that you're doing something off. This is me relaying, representing, here are the people that we talked to, here's the feedback that they gave, here's what I think we should do about it. I think that is important framing, because I do think that sometimes people in UX get told that they need to tell a story, and they're like, first we did this, and then we did this, and then we found this, and now we should do this. And it still comes across as a little bit like the researcher swooping in and telling you what to do and then flying away again, right? A little bit of that swoop and poop kind of thing. And I think that if you can remind people that this isn't a you versus me thing, and my opinion versus your opinion, we're all trying to serve the people who use the stuff we build better. And here's what the story is about those people. Here's what they need, here's what they said. Here's the information. And again, not just to relay it in terms of 5 out of 6 people could not find this thing, and 80% of people use this kind of browser. But if you can kind of help the other people in your team connect and empathize with the people who you're building for, that goes a long way. And it's a subtle shift, but if you can kind of present it like, here's a story about the people that we're serving, versus here's what I'm telling you to do differently, or here's what you've done wrong and we need to fix. So that, I think, is a kind of a subtle piece of that, but I think it's an important one. And it really helps you kind of build collaboration and make sure that, the things that are actually going to be right for your users are really thought about all the way through, and from more than just you and the kind of other people who are closest to the users.
I mean, I think you're touching on a good UX soft skill there, which is gentle storytelling. It's not, don't be the abrasive UXer, who is like, I'm going to tell you my story, and by the way, my story is right, and by the way, you're going to listen to me, or else I'm going to get very mad. I mean, you want to be a kind of a, if you want to succeed in life, succeed as a UX professional, be a gentle storyteller. Start your story with the happy parts, like these are the really good things. The users are very happy because of X, Y, and Z, and and you've done a great job, people, and legitimately, don't like BS it, but really, like, say, legitimately, you've done a good job doing this, and you've created happy people, and I can tell you some really like happy, good things about your product as part of my story, and how it's helped people. And okay, now we've talked about the good stuff. Let's kind of diverge a little bit, change gears, and talk about the not so good stuff. And it's not bad; it's just not so good. And then gently kind of frame the story. Very gentle, very kind as a UXer. And then when your story ends, the motivational, how are we going to take steps to fix it? How are we going to take steps to have the happy ending, the live happily ever after part of our story? And ultimately, I think that as a UXer, that's probably a good soft skill. And as a consultant, I'll say it gets you repeat work. When you do your job effectively, but also you do it with with kindness and concern and empathy for whomever you're talking to or talking with in those meetings.
Yeah, but I believe that
So
phenomenon is sometimes called a poop sandwich, where you encase not so good news with good news or positive things. Yeah, it's a popular thing. Chris is back. Hi,
so
Chris.
Corey, I mean, well, am I back? Am I okay? I think I am. Yeah.
Yeah,
For
no,
the
no,
moment.
Corey, the whole idea
audio
of
is
being a
stable, yeah.
gentle storyteller.
Oh wait, turn
Yeah,
off your video
being a
again.
gentle storyteller, that sounds
Yeah,
kind of interesting. Um, I, I think you're right that you can't go in and tell a story that makes the team out to be the baddies in the story, to be the evil people in the story. If you do that, they're never going to be on your side. If you make them into people who can help the hero achieve their goals, then you're more likely to have success for sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've talked a lot about arc, but we haven't talked a lot about characters or like who should be in
Right.
the story. And I think, Chris, that's a super good point that I think that there's sort of a misconception that there always has to be a bad guy or a villain or a bad
Right.
lady. But sometimes, sometimes the thing that's in the way is not really a villain. It's just sort of like a constraint of what you're working with, right? Like in the story I was telling
Mhm.
earlier about the people who had to get paid signing up for this app, um, there was a constraint about the internet that they worked on ships. There wasn't a way around providing them a different service, right? Like we couldn't improve, we couldn't just tell them we'll go to a place that has faster internet. They couldn't do that, right? So sometimes it's also worth
Mhm.
like kind of thinking about who is in the story, but also like what is in the story and what is changeable versus what is just a constraint that you're going to have to contend with. And maybe you've got to be creative about it, but maybe it can even be an opportunity. Like maybe there's something that you can figure out to do with it. That's good. But I think it's also important to kind of think about like who and what is in the story and what has to be there. And another way that I've used those kind of story arcs is to say, okay, that's how it's been done. Here's what's there now. But is that really serving us in this current context?
Right.
Um, just because that's how it's been done. Here's all this new stuff that's in the story now, right? Like if you're walking up the hill, now there's a boulder and some trees and, whatever sort of new context, a pandemic, whatever. There's some different stuff you have to think about now. It's not just a hill, it's a hill with all this other context. And some stuff you can get rid of, like maybe you can bulldoze the boulder, but maybe not. So I think that is a helpful context for it too, is to talk about like look at the kind of overall story of things and what's mutable and what's not.
No, for sure.
So
And
so the thing, David Mamet is a well, he's a director, he's a playwright, he's all sorts of other things. He said that I'm going to mangle the quote, but it's something along the lines of the best story you can tell is the one that has the shortest distance between the beginning and the end of the hero getting along their journey. So cutting out the bits you can cut out for sure, which are the bits which aren't really essential to telling the story. And then working out, like you say, which are the bits which can be changed and can't be changed. If it can't be changed, it might be an essential part of the story, like we're on a ship, we can't, so it's important, there's nothing we can do about this thing to change how much internet connectivity we have. But what else can you do? What else can you cut out because it's just not important to the story? That's going to make it easier for the people that you're telling the story to focus on the pieces you think they can make a change to, for sure.
yeah, no, we all like the wonderful novel, that goes on for 500 pages. But if you're telling a story for work, and for efficiency, be efficient. Get to the point quickly. Don't drag out those stories because people won't listen anymore. No one listens. I mean, people just don't. They don't read long text. They don't listen to long paragraphs of verbiage. As you speak them, get to the point quickly for sure. But I do also want to make sure we talk about storytelling in life, in career life before we end, because I think that everything we're talking about with respect to storytelling when we talk about our users is also just as effective when you're talking about your own career, when you're looking for a job, if you're a consultant looking for work. The narrative, the personal narrative of your own story arc, and I would encourage anyone listening to think about your own story arc of how you start in the field, how you progress, what challenges you encounter. It's just as important, and those skills are just as important, and the being kind in storytelling is just as important when you're going for interviews, or you create a portfolio. You create this portfolio of stories, and it's not just I did this, I did that. Look at this thing. It's the story of what you did. So really, that comes through everywhere too. Same story about the stories.
For sure. And I know that we could probably and maybe ought to spend a whole session of these talking about, like portfolios and storytelling for career stuff. But one thing that I know that Cory and I know you have talked about a lot, especially for people like us who don't necessarily make tangible things. People can be like, well, how do I tell a story? How do I create a portfolio? Like, I don't have screenshots. And I'm like, well, you could still tell a story about the team that you worked with, the problem you were trying to solve, how, your work impacted the overall process. You can absolutely tell a story. And yes, you can use some imagery. You can do screenshots of reports, or if you get permission, screenshots of sessions or whatever. There's a lot of imagery you can use, but I just want to be clear. A story is not about the pretty pictures in it. They can help sometimes, but that's not what it's about, right? Like the story, or presenting yourself, and the work that you do, and the work that you want to do is about that story. It's not about, well, I made this wireframe, or I made this comp, or we made this app. It's about telling the story about the work that you did, because nearly everything that ends up live has a team of people who have worked on it. Everybody who's worked on that has had, some kind of input, good, bad, or otherwise, has made some sort of impact on what ultimately goes live. And so one thing for people to know is, at least for me, when I'm looking at hiring people, I need to know how you interacted with all of those other people, because I need to know how you're going to interact with me and potentially my clients or their teammates. And so telling a story about your interactions in that regard can also be really helpful when you're trying to sort of figure out the best fit for you and for another, whether you're working with another independent person or interviewing at a team or whatever. But telling a story about interactions with people is a powerful tool there, and at least for me, much more powerful than a bunch of screenshots of pretty stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And just to be clear, as UX people, we still have pretty stuff too, because
sure.
we create personas, we create journey maps, we create story maps. So there's a bunch of stuff you can put in, but just throwing that in without any indication of why it's there, without the story behind it, is, like you say, it's not going to help. I need to know what the story is and what part of that story was your part of the story versus other people's. And to be clear, you don't have to be the one who led everything, who did everything. I want to see that you're a team player too, if I'm looking at your portfolio, because often your work you're going to be doing is as a team player, on a team in a new organization too. So yeah, it's there's still stuff that UXs can have, that researchers can have in a portfolio, for sure, that tells a good story. Wow. So thanks, guys, for both of you carrying this session without me because of my terrible technical issues. Um, I think we covered a lot, though. Stories to help convince a team of something, stories to help convince an employer of something that we want them to learn about us or about the work we do. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, about having this economical yet still very informative arc of information that we give people about the people who are using our products or about ourselves if we want to get a new job. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that today. And I also want to apologize for folks for not having really responded very well in the comments we've been getting because I, my technology,
Poor Chris. Everyone send Chris a virtual hug today.
yes, thank you. I like the virtual hugs. So yeah, we'll post some. I know that Amanda had some references to some books. We had a reference to one of Cory's courses, his empathy course. We'll put all that information on the website on the page for this episode. So each on our website on Sticky Notes Chat, each episode has its own page where we kind of sometimes do transcripts, sometimes do if I get around to actually doing the transcripts, but we will definitely post information on the stuff that we've talked about in the session. So if you want to learn more about this session, go to the website and look on the episode. This one was called Stories, so you'll see that in the list, and you'll be able to go and find out more information about what we did. If you liked this, follow us. You can follow each of us individually, and then there's also Sticky Notes Chat as a hashtag. Yes, you can follow hashtags on LinkedIn. That will get you information about our next sessions. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so through LinkedIn. You can contact any of us or contact us through the Sticky Notes Chat page on the site, or you can email us at chat@stickynotes.chat. Thank you, Cory. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone who's been watching us. We will be saying goodbye now, and we'll be back next week with a conversation that Cory's going to be hosting on pairing. Now, Cory said, "What do you mean about pairing? I don't think I do pairing." Then Amanda pointed out, "Dude, you've worked with me before. We were pairing on something."
Like a lot.
Sorry. Like a lot. So sorry, Cory, but yes. So Cory was like, "How am I going to be leading this conversation?" And we're like, "No, you do this." And so what we want to do is talk about how devs often pair program, and the companies who actually have devs doing this are like, wow, look at the benefits to this. Even though you might think there's a downside to having two people working on one thing, often those two brains can be better than one. You can end up with a much better solution. So we'll be talking about pairing in UX, pairing with other disciplines. That's all next week. Same time, same place. So Thursdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time in the US. Until then, I want to say goodbye, and thanks Amanda and Cory once again for holding this whole session together for us.
We'll work it out for next time. Bye, everyone.
We will. I will.
Yeah.
Bye.